One thing, as I was rereading the books a little bit, just in preparation for this interview, which was in comparison with our modern system where law is hierarchical and controlled by the state, there are lots of different sources of legal authority in your world. So executions come in private and public forms. You know, the public Ned Stark execution, the semi-public Karstark, and the Night Watchman who's killed in the beginning of the first book, and then very private executions by private parties.
Well, there's some are executions and some are murders. So
what's the difference?
One has to make a distinction. When Ned Stark executes the dessert at the beginning of the book, he is acting under proper legal authority as the Lord of Winterfell.
How about when Catelyn Stark?
He's acting in the king's name. He even says that in a little speech he gives.
Right.
You know, in the name of Robert of House Baratheon, the first of his name, etc., by the hand of Eddard Stark. There's a concept which is touched on briefly in the books of what the difference between a lord and a knight. There's a hierarchical feudal system in my world, just as there was in real medieval England and medieval Europe, but it's not exactly the same. I made a certain number of changes, in some ways simplifications, because as complex as Westeros and Seven Kingdoms are, they are nowhere near as complex as what you actually got in the real Middle Ages, where you need the scholarly books just to understand the relationships between some of the lords and their vassals and their lieges and etc. It got extremely complex, particularly the later you got into the period.
Right.
So I don't have like the 17 titles of Baron, Earl, Duke,
but you do have the heraldry,
etc. All of which had, in the real world had different ranks. I just have lords and knights, and someone has asked me what is the difference between them. Well, one of the differences is the lord has what's called the power of pit and gallows.
Mm-hmm.
That is, a lord has the power to punish, to administer criminal law on his own authority without having to go to someone else. While a knight, even a landed knight who has very extensive estates, and in some ways some of the big landed knights may have larger estates than some of the smaller lords, but the knight does not have the power of pit and gallows. And pit and gallows, of course, gallows is the ability to execute someone. Pit is the ability to confine them in a dungeon or something like that.
But you use the word power. I mean, there are lots of folks who do execute people in the books who are not lords, and so I guess what you're saying is just a legitimate power, right?
Yes, the legal power.
The legal power.
I mean,
and where does it come from?
Going on in much of the books too.
Right.
So.
And multiple sort of halfway legitimate kings. Where does the power come from in your world? Like, where does the sovereignty arise?
Well, as with medieval England, there's a sense that the authority derives from the king, and the king's authority arrives from God.
Is that why the church is able to arrest the queen for, I think it's adultery, at the end of A Feast for Crows?
Well, the church is a whole other issue. We're sort of getting into a side issue here, the faith, as I call them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, something that sort of, in the U.S., there's always this...
Part of before we get to church, let me say a little more about the lords.
Okay.
One of the things you have to keep in mind is the history of the Seven Kingdoms.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that although at the time of the books it is one single realm, in the past it has been many different realms. It has been seven kingdoms who really were separate kingdoms at the time of Aegon's conquest. And if you go back before that, it's many more than seven. It's hundreds of kingdoms, hundreds of tiny kingdoms. So some of these high lords in particular were kings in their own right at a certain point, and they're still very powerful lords. So you do get also some regional differences would be inevitable, and some of the kings, particularly the kings who had never been conquered, never been forced to surrender, the lords who can trace their lineage back to ancient kings who predate the Targaryen conquest by thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
They might have traditions and rights that are a little bit at variance with what a more centralized regime would have, because at one time there's this lingering tradition that they were their own authority. They were the ones anointed by God or the gods.
Right.
In the case of Westeros.
Right.
Now, the church law comes from the faith of the Seven was an Andal faith. They're the second of the human invaders who moved into the Seven Kingdoms, or whatever you call them if you go back thousands of years when there were hundreds of kingdoms. And they had these seven gods, and they're probably the most organized and dominant religion in the continent of Westeros, and the one that most resembles the medieval Catholic Church. And they did have their own courts, and they did have their own systems of justice and punishment for sins or transgressions. And of course, they were more powerful before the conquest. Before the conquest, you had seven kingdoms, but only one faith, and only one high septon, even though there were seven kings, which gave them a lot of influence. And they also had a fighting arm, and was much more powerful in the days before the Targaryen conquest, when there was one high septon, but numerous smaller kings. The Targaryen conquest, when the Seven Kingdoms were largely unified, was followed by a period of conflict between state and church, in which the power of the church was essentially broken by a succession of Targaryen kings, and their rights to do some of these things were diminished. So by the time the present series opens, A Song of Ice and Fire, the church is still influential, but it's no longer the power that it was 300 years before. Of course, you see that changing during the course of the books as a result of some of the events of the books. A series of new high septons come to power, and the one that you see coming to power in A Feast for Crows is very determined to restore the power of the church.
Right.
In some senses, he's equal to a reforming pope.
Right. With the faith militant, who is their military arm that they then sort of gain the power to have.
Which gives them swords to back up the decrees and essentially restores
the reason why I found it
as a player in the Game of Thrones.
Right. The reason why I found it so interesting was, an ongoing issue in current political debates in the country is sort of the degree to which the executive can be held to account in the civil court system, and the trial of Cersei, the queen, by the civil court system in the church, I thought was something which, today we had an analog, right, with the President Clinton being sued for sexual harassment, and the Supreme Court saying it was not going to distract his presidency. The question I had was sort of, did you have in mind any of that?
I suppose is the trials of people like Anne Boleyn,
right?
Catherine Howard in Tudor England.
Were they tried in church court, or were they tried in the king's court system? I have no idea.
Well, that's interesting too, because both of them were tried and executed during a period of change where, the king had recently assumed, had driven the Pope and his representatives out of England, and
right.
appointed himself the head of the Church of England. He wasn't able to get the result. When he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, he did take it to the church, and he tried to work with Cardinal Wolsey, and a special emissary was sent from Rome to hear the divorce case, but he didn't get the verdict that he wanted.
Right.
And at that point, he said, "Well, I'll make my own up."
Is that the sort of the historical period? I thought the historical period you had in mind was maybe a little bit earlier than Henry VIII.
Largely, it is, yes, but on the other hand, it's not one for one. I'm not
right.
just taking any particular event or war or character from history and filing off the serial numbers and
right.
dating it. I'm mixing and matching a number of things. I've drawn, the Wars of the Roses, as people pointed out, is certainly an important influence on my book. I've also looked at things like the Crusades, the Albigensian Crusade, the Crusades in the Middle East, the 100 Years' War, which was fascinating.
Are there lawyers in your books that just are off in the wings of the stage that haven't yet appeared?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really considered that until I started reading your those links that you sent to me.
Mm-hmm.
There are certainly laws, but is there a special class of advocates who make their living by interpreting those laws? My inclination is probably not, because a lot of the laws in my books are administered by lords. In some ways, it's a government that's much more of men than laws. I mean, we like to say our government in the United States is a government of laws, not men. In some ways, the Seven Kingdoms, I think, is the reverse. There is a basis of a law. But an awful lot depends on who is interpreting it, and who is sitting in the Lord's seat, who is sitting on the Iron Throne, and how they settle these disputes.
Well, those are ultimate questions, but I think in two places, I think one could have imagined lawyers, and one of them again will be this church trial, because there were church lawyers, in the ecclesiastical church system, there were lawyers who specialized in canon law. And the second one was, at least twice I can think of in the books, they're trials by combat. And I don't really know what the other alternative would be, but I assume it would be trial by jury. That the path that Tyrion did not choose both times. And I was thinking...
Well, he does choose in the first... in the second of his two trials, he is being tried. It's not by jury, it's by Lord. There's no jury of his peers, no 12 people that are randomly picked, but there are 3 lords who are sitting on his case and are hearing the evidence.
Right.
And, the...
Tyrell, I think, is one of them. I don't remember the other two.
Right, well, Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, is one of them, who was born in to sort of balance it, because they want a semblance of impartiality. Of course, it's a hopelessly, because his father is in some ways the presiding judge. He's the hand of the king, and his sister, who's also the daughter of the same father, is the chief complainant against it, the one who's accusing him of doing these things. But that does have semblance of his trial, where witnesses are being called forth, people are swearing oaths, people are testifying
right.
Against him and saying what they saw and what they did not saw. At a certain point, though, Tyrion realizes that it's hopeless. He's losing that, so he exercises his option as a lord to request the trial by combat instead.
Which was a bad
choice. Especially when Oberyn says he'll stand for him, he thinks he has a better chance there, and he has gotten off once before in the preceding trial by combat, where he rolled the dice that way, and they came up well for him.
See, if the books were being written by a law professor, that would have been the moment where the lawyer would have stepped in from the wings. And so...
right. Maybe there's a market there for a brand new hybrid, a series of medieval John Grisham novels.
Don't think that there aren't a lot of law professors who wouldn't like to be writing that exact thing.
It would be sort of interesting.
Interesting is a very nice way to say it.
It's only possible, the medieval John Grisham novel or the approach, if you have a world like mine, which is a relatively low magic world.